Okay, close your eyes for just a second. I want you to imagine trying to coordinate a simple group project with, say, 5 people. Pretty hard, right? Now take that and imagine trying to unite an incredibly diverse subcontinent. We're talking hundreds of millions of people who are completely divided by language, by social class, by region, and by religion. How in the world do you take all of those beautifully distinct, separate threads and somehow weave them together to stand up against a massive, entrenched, and incredibly powerful global empire? Well, that is exactly the monumental question we're tackling today. Welcome to this Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're tuning in, because today we are diving into one of the most fascinating transformations in modern history, nationalism in India. We're going to look really closely at how a feeling, a simple idea, developed into an absolute blazing fire of resistance under British rule. It's honestly a masterclass in strategy, human resilience, and the sheer power of unity. So let's just jump right in.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the spark of nationalism, move into the early Satyagraha movements, talk about the repression and tragedy that followed, explore the rise of mass resistance, and wrap up with building a collective identity.
Let's hit Section 1, the spark of nationalism.
Before we go any further, we need to make sure we're on the same page with our core term here. Nationalism in this specific context isn't just a political buzzword or a line drawn on a map. It's a deep feeling of unity among people, forged through a shared identity and a shared struggle. It is an intense collective psychological state. It's that sudden realization of, hey, my struggle is your struggle. For a population as massively diverse as India's, finding that shared struggle was absolutely crucial to building a unified identity.
And the true catalyst for this? It happened in 1915. Mahatma Gandhi returns to India from South Africa, which is actually where he first tested these methods, and he brings with him this radically novel concept called Satyagraha, along with the strict, unwavering principle of non-violence. Satyagraha roughly translates to truth force. The whole idea was that if your cause is fundamentally true and just, you literally don't need physical force to fight the oppressor. You fight them with moral clarity and non-violent resistance. It was a complete paradigm shift, a real game changer for the Indian resistance.
Moving into Section 2, early Satyagraha movements.
Now notice the pattern with these early protests. They are highly localized. First, you have the Champaran movement, which was aimed squarely at ending the brutal exploitation of indigo plantation workers. Next is the Kheda movement, where farmers stood together to demand desperately needed tax relief. And finally, the Ahmadabad movement, where mill workers organized and protested for fair wages. Gandhi was orchestrating targeted resistance for very specific groups. What this proves is that massive national movements don't just magically start everywhere all at once, right? They build momentum by addressing the immediate, deeply felt pain points of everyday people.
Which brings us to Section 3, repression and tragedy.
This is where the friction really hits a boiling point. You can see the stark contrast unfolding between the two sides. On one hand, you have Gandhi's approach, peaceful protest, Satyagraha, and absolute nonviolence. On the other hand, you get the panicked, heavy-handed British response, the Rowlatt Act of 1919. This law was exceptionally draconian. It basically allowed the British government to arrest and imprison anyone without a trial. Just imagine that for a second, living under the constant threat of arrest with zero right to defend yourself in court. It was a massive overreach, a clear sign of an empire feeling incredibly threatened, and unsurprisingly, it sparked absolute nationwide outrage.
And tragically, the outrage over the Rowlatt Act culminated in one of the absolute darkest days in history. At a place called Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, a large, peaceful crowd had gathered. Families, everyday people. And they were completely unarmed. Without any warning whatsoever, a British officer named Reginald Dyer blocked the only exit and ordered his troops to open fire directly into the dense crowd.
I just want to pause for a second and let that sink in. Hundreds died. More than 1,000 were injured. This wasn't just some political misstep or a bad policy. It was an outright atrocity. The sheer, devastating human cost of this repression changed the psychology of the Indian subcontinent forever. The British government had shown its most brutal face, and by doing so, they practically guaranteed that the Indian resistance would never be isolated or strictly local ever again.
That brings us to Section 4, the rise of mass resistance.
If we zoom out and look at the timeline of events, it perfectly captures this escalating momentum. From the hopeful arrival of Gandhi back in 1915 to the incredibly heavy-handed Rowlatt Act in 1919. That harsh repression directly birthed the non-cooperation movement in 1920, and then, a decade later, it crescendoed into the legendary 1930 Dandi March.
In just 15 short years, you go from an idea introduced by one man to a massive, beautifully coordinated national defiance. Let's look a little closer at how they actually pulled that defiance off.
Notice the incredibly deliberate escalation in these steps. First up, boycotting government schools. Next, and this really hit them where it hurts, boycotting foreign goods to cripple the British economy. Finally, resigning entirely from government jobs. They were systematically withdrawing their participation from society. The profound realization here? An empire simply cannot operate if you, the people, refuse to run its daily machinery.
So, by 1930, the strategy escalated to the legendary Dandi March. Now, you might be wondering, why salt? Well, the British held a strict monopoly on the production of salt. They were essentially taxing a basic human necessity to, quite literally, rub salt in the wound of their colonial subjects. By marching hundreds of miles to the sea and simply boiling seawater to make his own salt, Gandhi broke the law. It was this simple, quiet act, but it turned into a massive symbol of defiance that officially launched the civil disobedience movement. Millions of people suddenly realized that they too had the power to peacefully break unjust laws.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, building a collective identity.
Think about the sheer diversity of the people involved in this movement. You've got peasants, industrial workers, women, and incredibly wealthy business classes all participating side by side. But here's the catch. They initially brought entirely different expectations and motives to the table. A peasant obviously wanted lower land revenue. A business owner, they wanted protection against foreign imports. A worker just wanted better wages. If everyone is only fighting for their own specific interests, the whole movement fractures, right? So what was the glue holding it all together?
The glue was culture. They actively engineered a profound sense of collective belonging. They leaned heavily on inspiring nationalist songs, the revival of ancient Indian folklore, incredibly powerful shared symbols, and crucially, the creation of a national flag. These cultural touchstones bypassed all those regional and economic differences and spoke straight to people's hearts. It wove those vastly different classes together under one giant emotional umbrella.
So what is the ultimate takeaway from our explainer today? It's that this revolution wasn't just built on anger, and it wasn't just built on politics. It was this carefully constructed, beautifully maintained sense of collective belonging that finally united the populace. They forged a shared identity so incredibly strong that a diverse, historically divided subcontinent was able to stand shoulder to shoulder and ultimately defeat a global empire.
But I want to leave you with this final, kind of provocative thought. We've seen how the shared struggle against a massive common enemy forged this incredibly powerful weapon of nationalism. But what happens on the day after victory? Once that unifying common enemy is finally packed up and gone, how do all those incredibly diverse groups stay united? It's a huge question, and it's one that newly independent nations all over the world, including India, have had to wrestle with ever since. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, keep learning, and I will see you next time.